Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to look at ecosystems and energy. So in our last chapter, we learned about community ecology. And in community ecology, we talk about all the different populations of different organisms and how they interact. So predator-prey relationships, symbiosis, competition, etc. Keystone species, succession. Whereas in this chapter, what we're looking at is the whole ecosystem. And with the whole ecosystem, we're tying in now not just the biotic factors, but also the abiotic factors. So the temperature, the rainfall, the nutrients in the soil. What kind of soil is it made out of? Is it sandy soil? Is it loam? And so we're looking at community ecology added in with abiotic factors, which make up our ecosystem. So what we're going to focus on is energy flow and chemical cycling. So when we talk about chemical cycling, that's going to include the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle. And energy flow is what we look at trophic levels. How much energy is available in the primary producers, and then as it moves up the different trophic levels to your top level predators. So let's go ahead and start here. So here's the sun, and it shines down onto our plants. And so we take this peach tree here, and the peach tree is going to do photosynthesis. It's going to use water from the soil, taking up through its roots, carbon dioxide, and sunlight. So this peach tree takes in the carbon dioxide, uses the sunlight and water, and builds glucose. So now when an herbivore, like a squirrel, for example, comes and eats that peach tree, well, now you have that glucose going into the squirrel that's going to be broken down by the squirrel's mitochondria. So what we've learned back in cellular respiration is that as that squirrel breaks down that glucose that in the mitochondria, it's not 100% efficient. As those bonds are broken, there's heat being released. This can be seen in us when you go out and run or you exercise. You have heat coming off of your face, off of your body. You create heat as you break down food. And so some of the energy stored in those bonds, when those bonds are broken, some of that energy is converted into ATP, but some of that energy is also wasted as heat. So when we look at the different steps in a food web or a food chain, in each step, the energy that's available decreases because some of it is given off as heat. So now when this raccoon eats this squirrel, some of the energy from the food is now passed to the squirrel, then to the raccoon. But as the raccoon breaks down that squirrel, some of that energy that was stored in the tissues of the squirrel actually comes off as heat as well. Then when the coyote comes, or a wolf, I don't know, and eats that raccoon, some of that energy is also broken down and released as heat. Okay, so when we look at the other part of a food web, our food chain is in different trophic levels, is when we start with carbon dioxide going in. Now we're going to look at that C right there. So let's pay attention to that carbon, and if we look at chemical cycling as it goes through an ecosystem. So here you have the carbon is taken out of the air and built into a glucose molecule. There we see that C as part of glucose. Then when the squirrel eats that glucose, it can either be used to build the squirrel, or the squirrel can break that glucose down for energy, and this carbon dioxide molecule is released during oxidative phosphorylation or the Krebs cycle. So there's that carbon. Or sometimes that carbon can be incorporated into the body tissues of the squirrel, and it can be incorporated and turned into stored energy in the form of fat. So you would see that fatty acid there has carbons. Then when the raccoon eats the squirrel, that carbon may be passed to the raccoon. The raccoon might use it in its body, and who knows, it might break it down and release it as carbon dioxide, or incorporates it into its tissues. Could also poop it out. And so if it poops it out, well, now it's in poop, and maybe a dung beetle will come and eat that dung, and now that carbon is passed to the dung beetle. Or the carbon could end up in an amino acid. Remember, amino acids have that central carbon. So that carbon could have many fates. It can come off as carbon dioxide. It can be used to build amino acids. It can be excreted out of the body and then passed on to a dung beetle. So let's say that coyote, though, does eat that raccoon. Well, now that carbon is passed to the coyote. So when we look at energy flow through an ecosystem versus matter, like carbon here flowing through an ecosystem, there's a difference. This heat, you can't get it back. Just like I can't capture the heat off my face and use it for energy for later, the heat, once that energy is converted to heat, it's gone forever. It's not in a usable form for living things. Versus matter just gets transformed as it moves through an ecosystem. It was first a carbon dioxide, then it was a glucose, maybe it was a fatty acid, maybe it's back to carbon dioxide, ooh, maybe it's part of an amino acid, maybe it's in the body tissues of that coyote. So that one carbon molecule just transforms as it goes through both biotic, the living things, and abiotic, the non-living, like the air. And so the matter versus energy are very different on how they transfer and flow through ecosystems. Matter is transformed, whereas energy gets used up, and a lot of it is given off as heat. So compare and contrast the flow of matter and energy in your box 1. Okay, so now we're going to look at primary production. And primary production, as you can guess, deals with primary productivity, or plants, and photosynthesis. So here I see a rainforest. Oh, so much biodiversity. And the sun shines down, does photosynthesis. So when we look at this, the primary production is the amount of light energy converted into chemical energy by autotrophs. Basically photosynthesis, how much sunlight is being stored in the bonds of glucose. Okay, so there it is. So how much, in this case, in these plants, a lot of that could be cellulose, could be glucose, could be fructose. So we have the energy from the sun being stored in the bonds there of glucose molecules. Now here we look at Joshua Tree National Park. So when we look at this desert ecosystem versus the rainforest ecosystem, and we look at them in terms of primary productivity, we see that the rainforest has much more primary productivity. Even though they both have large amounts of sunlight, the limiting factor here is going to be water. The desert has very little water compared to the rainforest, and therefore the rainforest is able to do a lot more photosynthesis and have high primary productivity. Okay, so primary production goes in your box 2. All right, so now here we see the sun shining down on plants, and we're going to discuss the difference between gross primary productivity and net primary productivity. So here, when we look at gross primary productivity, the GPP, that's the total amount of energy from sunlight converted to chemical energy. But when we really think about this, do plants do photosynthesis for us? No, the plants are also going to use some of that energy. The plants have mitochondria. They're going to use some of that energy that they took from the sun and converted and saved in chemical energy in the bonds of the glucose molecules. They're going to use it themselves. So that leads us to, oh, there's the plants. They use it for reproduction. That's what flowers are for. So plants will use some of this chemical energy for life, growth, repair, metabolism, and reproduction. So that leads us to net primary productivity. And net primary productivity is the total primary productivity, the GPP, the gross primary productivity, minus the energy that plant used for itself. So when we look at this, what's left over? It's the what's left over for the next trophic level. So if you look at the total photosynthesis in an ecosystem, that's made by the plants taking sunlight, how much energy is being stored, well, the plants are going to use some of that energy. So what's left over for the herbivores and the primary consumers in terms of energy is our NPP. Okay, so when we look at this, you see that the GPP is the glucose produced during photosynthesis, and the NPP is the remaining glucose available to be laid down as new biomass. So these grapes here, if I don't even know what eats grapes. If an animal comes and eats some grapes, well, now that carbon, that glucose, those molecules can be used to build the body of the herbivore. And so that's NPP. Okay, so how are GPP and NPP related is in your box 3. So when we look at a chart of net primary productivity for biomes, and we look on land, what we can see is that terrestrial biomes means land. Swamps and marshes have high primary productivity, and so do rainforests. Lots of sunlight, lots of water available. You have your temperate forest, and the temperate forest you can think of is like the forest you see in like the Hunger Games. You find along the east coast of the United States. The northern coniferous forest, conifers are pine trees. So think about like large forests of pine trees up near like the Arctic Circle kind of. The savanna is going to be open grassland with few trees. Agricultural land or crops. And then woodland and shrubland, small bushes and stuff. Temperate grassland. And then you can see here where the extreme desert and desert shrub have very little primary productivity because water is one of the limiting factors there. Now, in aquatic ecosystems, you would think, wow, the ocean has so much sun and so much water. There should be enormous amounts of primary productivity. However, sometimes there can be other limiting factors. We think about, well, what do plants need? They need water, they need sun, they need carbon dioxide, but they also need nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. But estuaries are kind of where the ocean and the land and freshwater meet. Are going to have high primary productivity going on. Lakes and streams. The continental shelf is where like the continent kind of drops down into the ocean. Okay, so when we look at our oceans, though, there's little tiny microscopic organisms that live there. We have phytoplankton, we have zooplankton that can really be seen underneath a microscope. So here, though, we see large, like, these are like algal blooms. The green stuff there is like enormous amounts of little tiny organisms doing photosynthesis. You can see the chlorophyll in the green there. And so when we look at what will limit primary productivity in the ocean? Like, why doesn't the open ocean have enormous amounts of photosynthesis? We got to think about this. Light is near the surface, and as it goes down, the light is it dissipates and it doesn't really reach super far down. So light could be a limiting factor in the ocean, but so are nutrients. Nutrients are actually more important than light intensity. In the ocean and aquatic ecosystems, nutrients are going to be the limiting factors. And so when we think about which 5 elements are necessary for life on Earth, we have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which make our carbohydrates and our fatty acids. But we remember proteins and DNA and RNA, nucleic acids. We also need nitrogen and phosphorus. So the ocean has an abundance of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So really the limiting factors in the ocean are going to be the nutrients, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And so when we look at the ocean, the limiting nutrient is the limiting nutrient is the element that must be added for production to increase. And so when the ocean is low in nitrogen, it actually doesn't have much photosynthesis going on. In freshwater, phosphorus is actually a limiting factor. Now, the way I remember that is the ocean needs nitrogen, and then freshwater needs phosphorus. So the ocean actually has abundance of phosphorus, and freshwater has an abundance of nitrogen, so vice versa become the limiting factors. Okay, so if you could make a note about limiting nutrients in aquatic ecosystems in your box 4, that would be fantastic.